When you think of a pirate ship, you probably picture something magnificent. A towering galleon with billowing black sails, a skull and crossbones flag snapping in the tropical wind, a charismatic captain standing at the helm with a tricorn hat and a gleaming cutlass, barking orders to a loyal crew of swashbuckling adventurers. Hollywood has given us this image 1,000 times. The romance of the open sea, the thrill of treasure, the freedom of a life beyond the law. It is a fantasy so seductive that we forget to ask an obvious question. What did a pirate ship actually smell like? Because the first thing that would hit you, long before the romance or the adventure, was the stench. Imagine the concentrated odor of 100 unwashed men crammed into a wooden box roughly the size of a modern apartment, surrounded by rotting food, stagnant bilge water, tar, gunpowder residue, animal waste, and the unmistakable sweetness of decay. A pirate ship was not a vessel of freedom. It was a floating prison that you chose. And most who chose it were so desperate that this still seemed like an improvement. So what was it really like to live on one? To understand pirate life, you have to understand the world that created it. The golden age of piracy, roughly 1680 to 1730, was not some random outbreak of lawlessness. It was a direct product of empire, war, and economics. European powers, especially England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands, had spent more than a century fighting over the Caribbean, the coast of West Africa, and the sea lanes that connected the New World to the Old. During wartime, these nations hired private ship captains, called privateers, to attack enemy merchant vessels. It was state-sanctioned theft. You were handed a letter of marque, essentially a legal license to plunder, and you were sent out to cause as much damage to your enemy's commerce as possible. When the wars ended, the licenses expired. Thousands of trained armed sailors were suddenly thrown out of work. The Royal Navy had no use for them. The merchant fleet paid starvation wages. The sugar plantations were worse, and so these men, skilled navigators, experienced fighters, men who had already tasted the chaos of the sea, turned to the one trade that still made use of their talents. They became pirates. The Caribbean of the early 18th century was the perfect environment for it. The sea was dotted with hundreds of islands, many uninhabited, with hidden coves and shallow channels where a small, fast ship could vanish and a heavy warship could not follow. The trade routes were dense with fat merchant vessels carrying sugar, rum, tobacco, silk, spices, and sometimes silver or gold. Colonial governors were often corrupt, willing to look the other way for a share of the profits. And the distances were vast. A naval patrol might take weeks to respond to a report of piracy, by which time Port Royal in Jamaica, Nassau in the Bahamas, and the coast of Madagascar became notorious pirate havens, places where stolen goods could be fenced and crews could resupply with no questions asked. If you wanted to disappear from respectable society and reinvent yourself as something dangerous, this was the world that would welcome you. And who were these men? The popular image suggests English rogues, and many were, but the reality was far more diverse. A typical pirate crew in the early 18th century was a startling mix of nationalities, races, and backgrounds. English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Dutch, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Scandinavian, and colonial American sailors served side by side. Escaped and freed enslaved Africans made up a significant portion of many crews. Some historians estimate that black men comprised as much as a quarter to a third of Caribbean pirate crews during the Golden Age. On a pirate ship, your ability to work mattered more than your origin. This was not racial utopia. The period was saturated with the slave trade, and some pirates participated in it. but it was remarkably egalitarian compared to any other institution of the era. Many pirates were former merchant sailors who had endured such appalling conditions, wages withheld for months, brutal discipline, rotten food, that they simply snapped when the opportunity arose. Others were former Royal Navy men, hardened by years of impressment, the legal kidnapping of civilian men into naval service. A press gang would sweep through a port town, seize any able-bodied man they could find, and force him into years of service at sea. Men who escaped this system had little love for the authority that had enslaved them. Some pirates were genuine criminals, murderers, thieves, debtors fleeing prison. Others were indentured servants who had run from their contracts on the sugar plantations, where the work was so brutal and the death rate so high that a Caribbean plantation was scarcely distinguishable from a death camp. The one thing almost all pirates had in common was desperation. These were not wealthy men choosing adventure. They were poor men choosing survival. Now, picture the ship itself. Most pirate vessels were not the massive galleons you see in paintings. Those were warships or treasure carriers, far too large and crew-heavy for piracy. The typical pirate ship was a sloop or a brigantine, a vessel between 50 and 80 feet long, with one or two masts and a shallow draft that let it navigate coastal waters and river mouths where bigger ships ran aground. A successful pirate captain might eventually command a captured frigate with 20 or 30 guns. But even then, the ship was modified for speed, not comfort. Every unnecessary weight was stripped away. Cabins were removed or reduced. Extra cannon ports were cut into the hull. The goal was to overtake a merchant vessel quickly, board it before the crew could organize a defense, and get away before a warship appeared on the horizon. As you approach the ship from a longboat, the first thing you notice is how low it sits in the water. The hull is dark with tar and pitch, a waterproofing mixture that needs constant reapplication in the tropical heat. Patches of barnacles and seaweed cling to the waterline, slowing the ship and creating an endless maintenance headache. The wood itself is often in questionable condition. Tropical shipworms, tiny mollusks that bore through timber the way termites eat wood, are a constant plague. Some ships were literally eaten from the inside out within a year or two, if not regularly careened, hauled onto a beach and scraped clean. Careening was one of the most dangerous and labor-intensive necessities of pirate life. Every few months, the crew had to find a secluded beach, ideally on an uninhabited island, run the ship aground at high tide, and then heave it onto its side using ropes attached to the masts and anchored to trees on shore. With the hull exposed, men scraped away barnacles, seaweed, and worm-damaged timber with iron tools, replaced rotten planks, and recoated the hull with a mixture. The entire process took days, sometimes more than a week. During this time, the ship was utterly defenseless, lying on its side with its guns pointed at the sky. If a naval patrol discovered a pirate crew careening, it was a massacre. The pirates could not flee, could not fight effectively, and could not hide. Every pirate captain lived with the knowledge that this essential maintenance operation could be his last. The choice of careening ground was a life or death decision, and the secluded coves of the Bahamas, the coast of Honduras, and the islands of the Indian Ocean became prized locations precisely because they offered the seclusion that careening demanded. Climb aboard, and the deck is a cluttered, chaotic workspace. Coils of rope lie everywhere. Cannons are lashed to the bulwarks with heavy tackle. Buckets, barrels, spare sails, and tools occupy every available surface. The deck planking is rough and uneven, warped by sun and salt water, and you learn quickly to watch where you step. Bare feet on a deck full of splinters, tar, and the occasional nail is an education in pain. The helm is nothing glamorous, just a wooden tiller or a simple wheel connected by rope to the rudder. There is no captain's bridge, no elevated command deck in the Hollywood sense. The quarterdeck at the stern is slightly raised, and whoever is steering stands there exposed to the elements. Now go below. Duck your head. The space between decks is rarely more than 5 feet, often less. The gun deck, if the ship has one, is a long, low corridor lined with cannons on either side, their muzzles pointing out through square ports in the hull. Between the guns is where you sleep. There are no individual cabins for ordinary crew. You sling a hammock from the beams overhead, and your allocated space is roughly 14 inches wide. The man next to you is close enough that you can feel him breathe. The air down here is thick and heavy, a soup of human sweat, tar fumes, damp wood, and the sour tang of the bilge, the lowest part of the hull where seawater, leak provisions, and every kind of filth collect into a black, stinking puddle that sloshes with the motion of the ship. In rough weather, that bilge water comes up through the deck planking. In hot weather, it breeds mosquitoes. Always, it stinks. Below the gun deck, deeper in the belly of the ship, is the hold. This is where provisions are stored. Barrels of salted meat, hardtack biscuits, casks of water and rum, gunpowder in sealed kegs, spare rope, sailcloth, and whatever cargo or plunder the crew has recently taken. The hold is dark. The only light comes from a lantern, carefully shielded, because an open flame near gunpowder will end your career and your life simultaneously. Rats live here. They always live here. On every ship in this era, rats are a permanent population, gnawing through food stores, chewing rope, and occasionally biting sleeping men. Cats are kept aboard specifically to hunt them, and a good ship's cat is worth its weight in supplies. The captain's cabin, if it exists, is at the stern, directly under the quarterdeck. On a pirate ship, this space is far less luxurious than on a naval vessel. The captain of a pirate crew does not have the absolute authority of a Royal Navy captain. He is elected by the crew and can be voted out at any time. His cabin might have a table, a chair, a chest for charts, and a slightly better hammock or a narrow cot. He might have a window, the stern windows that let light into the aft cabin. But it is still a small, cramped, damp wooden box, and it smells exactly like the rest of the ship. Your day on a pirate ship begins before sunrise. The watch system runs around the clock. The crew is divided into 2 or sometimes 3 watches, each taking shifts of 4 hours on and 4 hours off. If you are on the morning watch, a sharp whistle or a kick to your hammock wakes you at 4 in the morning. The ship never sleeps, even when anchored. Someone is always on deck, scanning the horizon, checking the rigging, watching for leaks. You roll out of your hammock, which you have learned to do in a single practice motion, because falling out in the dark and landing on a cannon is not something you do twice, and you climb the ladder to the deck. The tropical air hits you like a wall of warm, damp cloth. If there is a breeze, it is a blessing. If the air is still, the heat is already building, even before dawn. Your first duty might be to pump the bilge. Every wooden ship leaks. It is not a defect. It is a feature of the construction. The planks swell and shrink with temperature and humidity, and water seeps in constantly through the seams. The bilge pump is a hand-operated device that requires 2 men to work it, pumping in rhythm for sometimes an hour at a stretch. It is backbreaking, monotonous work, and the water that comes up is foul beyond description. After the bilge is pumped, there are ropes to check, sails to inspect for tears, deck planking to scrub with a holystone. a block of sandstone that you push back and forth on your hands and knees. The ship is a machine that requires constant maintenance, and every man is expected to contribute. By mid-morning, the work shifts to the specific demands of the day. If the ship is under sail, the crew works the rigging, an intricate web of ropes and pulleys that controls the sails. Adjusting course or speed requires men to climb the ratlines, the rope ladders attached to the masts, sometimes 70 or 80 feet above the deck. At the top, you stand on a narrow wooden platform called a top, or you edge out along a yard, the horizontal spar from which the sail hangs, with nothing beneath you but the deck or the ocean. You hold on with one hand and work the sail with the other, gathering heavy, wet canvas and tying it off with gaskets while the ship rolls beneath you. In calm weather, this is merely terrifying. In a storm, it is suicidal, but it must be done. If a sail is not furled before a squall hits, the wind can shred the canvas in seconds or worse, snap the mast like a dry twig. The lookout sits in the crow's nest at the very top of the mainmast, scanning the horizon in every direction with a spyglass. This is the most important position on a pirate ship during a hunt. The man who first spots a sail on the horizon earns a bonus from the eventual prize, a powerful incentive to stay alert through hours of numbing boredom. As the afternoon wears on and the tropical sun reaches its peak, the heat below decks becomes almost unbearable. Men who are off watch seek shade wherever they can find it, under a stretched piece of sailcloth on deck, in the shadow of the mainmast, anywhere the faint breeze can reach them. Some men close or splice rope, skills that every sailor learns and practices almost unconsciously. Others sleep, though sleeping in the heat and the noise and the constant rolling of the ship is an acquired art. By late afternoon, the second meal of the day is served, usually identical to the first. Salt meat, hardtack, perhaps a piece of dried fish. The monotony of the diet is soul-crushing. Men dream about fresh bread, about roasted chicken, about fruit. When evening falls, the ship transforms slightly. Lanterns are lit, sparingly, always sparingly, because fire is the great fear, and the off-duty crew gathers on deck if the weather permits. This is when the music starts, the storytelling begins, and the rum ration is consumed with something approaching ritual solemnity. The night watch takes its position, and the ship settles into a rhythm of creaking timber, lapping water, and the distant sound of someone playing a fiddle in the dark. Navigation is handled by the captain or the sailing master, if the crew has one. The tools are simple: a compass, a lead line for measuring depth, a cross-staff or backstaff for measuring the angle of the sun to determine latitude, and a collection of hand-drawn charts that are often wildly inaccurate. Longitude cannot be reliably determined at sea in this era. The marine chronometer will not be perfected until the 1760s, so navigation is partly science, partly art, and partly educated guessing. Getting lost is easy. Running aground on an uncharted reef is common, and when it happens far from shore, there is no rescue coming. Breakfast, if you can call it that, happens around 7 or 8 in the morning. The cook, a position often given to a crew member too injured to do physical labor, works in the galley, a tiny space amidships with a brick or iron firebox called a caboose. Cooking with an open fire on a wooden ship is as dangerous as it sounds, and in rough weather, the fire is extinguished entirely, leaving the crew to eat cold provisions. On a calm day, the standard meal is salted pork or beef boiled in a copper pot, served with hardtack, a dense, unleavened biscuit baked so thoroughly that it has the consistency of a brick. Hardtack will last for months, even years, without spoiling. It will also break your teeth if you bite into it carelessly. The standard practice is to soak it in water, broth or rum to soften it. Even so, it often harbours weevils, small beetles whose larvae bore into the biscuit and are frequently eaten unknowingly or knowingly, because protein is protein when you are 3 weeks from the nearest port. The salt meat is not much better. Preserved in barrels of heavy brine, it has to be soaked for hours before cooking to make it edible, and even then it has a texture that one sailor described as mahogany, and a taste that required extraordinary imagination to associate with anything that had once been alive. Fresh food is available only immediately after a port visit or a successful raid on a merchant vessel. When they get it, pirates eat fresh fruit, vegetables, poultry, and fresh-baked bread with the desperate enthusiasm of men who know it will not last. The rest of the time, it is salt, 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 supplemented by whatever fish the crew can catch. And catch they do. Trolling lines are kept trailing from the stern almost constantly, and a good catch of tuna, dolphinfish or bonito is cause for genuine celebration. In the Caribbean, pirates would raid turtle nesting beaches, capturing green turtles that could weigh over 300 pounds. The turtles were kept alive on their backs in the hold. They could survive for weeks without food or water, providing a source of fresh meat in an otherwise preserved food wasteland. Turtle soup became such a staple of pirate cuisine that certain islands in the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands were known primarily as turtle grounds. When the crew anchored at an uninhabited island, hunting parties would go ashore for wild pigs, goats descended from livestock abandoned by earlier settlers, birds, and whatever edible plants they could find. These provisioning stops were essential and eagerly anticipated. The chance to eat something fresh, to walk on solid ground, to breathe air that did not reek of bilge, was a luxury that no amount of plunder could replace. The drink situation is equally grim and equally essential. Fresh water does not stay fresh in a wooden barrel on a tropical ship. Within weeks, it turns green with algae, develops a thick scum on the surface, and tastes like swamp. The solution, universally adopted across all navies and pirate fleets alike, is alcohol. Rum is the lifeblood of the Caribbean pirate. Every man receives a daily ration, typically a half pint of rum, sometimes mixed with water to make grog, a drink popularized by the Royal Navy but adopted enthusiastically by pirates. Beer and wine are also carried when available, though they spoil faster than rum. Drunkenness is a constant issue. Many pirate articles, the written codes of conduct that governed most pirate ships, include rules against drinking on duty, with punishments ranging from loss of rations to flogging. But enforcement is uneven, and the line between enough to cope and too drunk to function is crossed frequently. One of the great ironies of pirate life is that men who prided themselves on freedom were often enslaved by the bottle, drinking not for pleasure, but because the alternative, warm, green, foul-tasting water, was genuinely nauseating. Now, about your body. Hygiene on a pirate ship is not a priority. It is not even a concept in the way we understand it. You do not bathe. There is no facility for bathing, and fresh water is far too precious to waste on washing. Seawater is used occasionally. You might strip down and haul a bucket of ocean water over your head on a hot day, but salt water leaves a sticky residue on the skin and does nothing for the lice that have taken up permanent residence in your clothing and hair. Lice are universal. Every man on the ship has them. They live in the seams of your shirt, in your breeches, in your hair and beard. At night, they bite. You scratch until you bleed, and the scratches become infected in the tropical humidity. Body odor is not something anyone notices because everyone smells the same. A ripe animal stench that becomes so normal you stop registering it within a few days. Your clothes are the same ones you have worn for weeks or months. Laundry does not exist. When your shirt rots off your body, you replace it from whatever the ship's slop chest contains or from the cargo of a captured vessel. Pirates are famous for their flamboyant clothing, silk coats, velvet breeches, feathered hats. And this is not vanity. It is practicality. When you capture a merchant ship carrying fine clothing, you take the best for yourself. A pirate wearing a stolen silk shirt is not making a fashion statement. He is wearing the only clean shirt available. Your teeth, if you still have them, are in poor condition. Sugar and starch dominate the diet, and there is no dental care whatsoever. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, loosens teeth, makes gums bleed, and causes old wounds to reopen. On long voyages without fresh fruit, scurvy can disable half a crew. Even pirates who survive the disease are left with blackened, loose teeth and a haunted look that no amount of stolen silk can disguise. The toilet situation deserves special mention because it tells you everything about the dignity of daily life at sea. The head, the ship's toilet, is located at the very front of the vessel, the bow, in an exposed area called the beakhead. It consists of a plank with a hole cut in it, suspended over the open ocean. There are no walls, no privacy, no shelter from wind or spray. You sit on this plank, exposed to the weather and to anyone who happens to be working nearby, and you relieve yourself into the sea. In rough weather, waves crash through the beakhead, drenching you. In calm weather, the smell hangs. At night, many men simply use a bucket below decks rather than navigate the dark, wet deck to the bow. And these buckets are not always emptied promptly. The result is an atmosphere below decks that visitors from shore, prisoners, captives, newly recruited crew, often described as physically overwhelming, a smell so dense and layered that it triggered immediate nausea. Despite these conditions, or perhaps because of them, social life on a pirate ship was remarkably organized. This is one of the great surprises of pirate history. Far from being anarchic mobs, most pirate crews operated under written constitutions that were, in some ways, more democratic than anything existing in the legitimate nations of their time. These documents, known as Articles of Agreement or Ship's Articles, were drawn up before a voyage began and signed, or marked with an X, by every member of the crew. The articles covered everything: how plunder would be divided, what compensation was owed for injuries, what offences would be punished, and how, who had authority, and under what conditions. The typical division of plunder was strikingly egalitarian. The captain received 1.5 to 2 shares. The quartermaster, the second in command, who represented the crew's interests and managed daily discipline, received 1.25 to 1.5 shares. Every ordinary crew member received 1 full share. Compare this to a Royal Navy vessel, where the captain might take 1/4 of all prize money, and ordinary sailors received a pittance, often years late. Compare it to a merchant ship, where the owner took the profits and the sailors were paid a flat wage that barely covered their debts to the ship's store. Pirates understood economics. They knew that fair division kept crews loyal and mutiny rare. The captain of a pirate ship was not a tyrant. He was an elected leader whose authority was contingent on success and fairness. If a captain made bad decisions, pursuing targets that were too dangerous, dividing plunder unfairly, or simply failing to find prizes, the crew could vote to remove him. This happened regularly. Captains were deposed, replaced, and occasionally marooned by their own men. The quartermaster served as a check on the captain's power, handling disputes between crew members, overseeing the distribution of food and drink, and administering punishments. This was not anarchy. It was a rough, practical democracy born of necessity. Men who had been abused by the rigid hierarchies of the Navy and the merchant fleet created something different. A system where your voice counted, your labor was compensated, and your leader answered to you. The articles even included what we might today call disability insurance. Bartholomew Roberts' articles, one of the best documented examples, specified that a man who lost a right arm in battle would receive 600 pieces of 8 in compensation. A left arm was worth 500, a right leg 500, a left leg 400. An eye or a finger had its own price. This was not generosity. It was a calculated system to encourage men to fight without the paralyzing fear of being maimed and abandoned. Entertainment on a pirate ship was rough, loud, and essential for sanity. Music was common: fiddles, drums, concertinas, and whatever instruments the crew could play or had stolen. Dancing was a regular activity, despite the cramped conditions, and men danced with each other without any stigma, because there was simply no one else to dance with. Gambling with dice and cards was universal, despite being officially forbidden in many articles. The fear was not moral, but practical, since gambling debts caused fights. Storytelling was perhaps the most important entertainment of all. In an era before mass literacy, the ability to tell a good story made you valuable company. Men who had sailed widely, who had been shipwrecked or captured, or had visited exotic ports, were listened to with genuine fascination. These stories, embellished with each retelling, are part of the reason pirate legends grew so enormous. Every real event was polished into myth around the lamp on a warm Caribbean night. Drinking, of course, was both entertainment and medication. When a prize was taken and rum was plentiful, a crew might celebrate for days, anchored in some hidden cove, completely insensible. These debauches were legendary and often followed by spectacular hangovers, regret, and a return to the grinding routine of the sea. The pirate havens, Nassau, Port Royal before the earthquake, Tortuga, St. Mary's Island off Madagascar, were where the social world of piracy reached its fullest expression. When a crew came ashore with money in their pockets, the port economy sprang to life. Taverns, gambling houses, and brothels catered specifically to pirates, charging outrageous prices because the money came easy and went faster. A sailor who had spent months at sea in misery might blow his entire share of a prize in a single week of drinking and carousing. As one contemporary observer noted in 1724, pirates spend with great profusion, paying sometimes 50 or 60 pieces of 8 for a bowl of punch, and they are not more proud of their plunder than liberal in distributing it. The tavern keepers, prostitutes, fences who bought stolen goods, and merchants who sold supplies without asking questions formed a shadow economy that depended entirely on piracy. These were not lawless places. They had their own rules, their own hierarchies, and their own systems of trust and reputation. A pirate who cheated a fence or assaulted a tavern keeper might find himself unwelcome at the one place he could safely resupply. Two women in particular shattered the assumption that piracy was an exclusively male world. Anne Bonny and Mary Red sailed with Calico Jack Rackham's crew in 1719 and 1720, fighting alongside the men and, by several accounts, fighting harder than most of them. When Rackham's ship was captured by a pirate hunter, it was Bonny and Red who resisted while the male crew hid below decks, too drunk to fight. At Rackham's execution, Bonny reportedly told him, "Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Their story is exceptional. Women on pirate ships were rare, but it illuminates the radical nature of a world where at least sometimes, what you could do mattered more than who society said you were. Conflict between crew members was managed through the articles and the authority of the quartermaster, but violence was never far from the surface. These were armed men living in close quarters under extreme stress, and disagreements could escalate with lethal speed. The articles typically prohibited fighting aboard ship. The standard rule was that disputes would be settled on shore, often by duel. If two men had a grievance that could not be resolved through mediation, they would be put ashore at the next opportunity, given pistols and cutlasses, and allowed to fight it out face to face. This system sounds brutal, but it served a purpose. It prevented the kind of mass brawl that could disable a crew in the middle of the ocean. Punishments for violating the articles were severe and public. Flogging was common. Marooning, being left on a deserted island with a pistol, a bottle of water, and nothing else, was the ultimate punishment short of death. It was slow execution disguised as mercy. The keel hauling, dragging a man underneath the ship from one side to the other, his body scraping against the barnacle-encrusted hull, was rarer than legend suggests but not unheard of, and it was among the most horrific punishments devised by seafaring men. The barnacles acted like 1,000 tiny razors, flaying the skin from the victim's body. If the rope was long enough that the man passed slowly, he might drown. If it was shorter, he emerged on the other side alive but bleeding from head to foot, with wounds that almost inevitably became infected. The mere threat of such punishment was usually sufficient to maintain discipline. And then there was the actual business of piracy, the attack itself. Contrary to the Hollywood image of broadside cannon battles and dramatic boarding actions, most pirate attacks were exercises in psychological warfare. The goal was to force a surrender without a fight. A pirate ship approaching a merchant vessel would first raise a false flag, the colors of a friendly nation, to get close. When near enough, the pirate flag would be hoisted, and this was the critical moment. The pirate flag, whether a plain black flag, a red flag meaning no quarter, or one of the personalized designs featuring skulls, skeletons, hourglasses, or bleeding hearts, was a message. It said, "Surrender now, and you will be treated reasonably. Resist, and everyone dies." This was not an empty threat. Pirates deliberately cultivated a reputation for extreme violence against those who resisted, precisely so that most targets would surrender without resistance. And it worked. The vast majority of merchant ships, when confronted by a pirate vessel, struck their colors and surrendered. The crews were usually professional sailors, not soldiers, and they had little motivation to die defending cargo that belonged to wealthy owners thousands of miles away. After a surrender, the pirates would board, inspect the cargo, take what they wanted, and sometimes offer the merchant crew the chance to join them. A surprising number accepted. The conditions on a merchant ship were often so miserable, worse pay, worse food, harsher discipline, that piracy looked like a promotion. But when a ship did resist, the violence was extreme and purposeful. Pirates used terror as a tool. Captains who fought back might be tortured. There are documented accounts of pirates tying burning fuses between prisoners' fingers, slashing them with swords, or employing a technique called wooding, where a rope was tied around a man's head and twisted with a stick until his eyes bulged from their sockets. This was not sadism for its own sake, though some pirates were genuinely sadistic. It was strategic. Every act of publicized cruelty was an investment in future surrenders. The more terrifying a pirate captain's reputation, the less often he actually had to fight. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, understood this perfectly. He wove slow-burning cannon fuses into his enormous beard before battle, creating a demonic halo of smoke around his face. He carried 6 pistols strapped to his chest, He cultivated the image of a man too dangerous and too insane to resist. And it worked. Most of his prizes were taken without firing a shot. Now we come to the darkness that no amount of adventure can soften. Disease killed far more pirates than combat ever did. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, typhus, and a dozen other tropical diseases ripped through crews with devastating regularity. A ship that left port with 100 men might arrive at its destination with 60. The sick were laid below decks with no medicine, no ventilation, and no real care. The ship's surgeon, if one existed, had a chest of basic instruments: saws, knives, forceps, cauterizing irons, and a supply of rum for anesthesia. Surgery meant amputation, performed on a table or a hatch cover while crewmates held the patient down. There were no antiseptics. Infection was not a risk, it was a certainty. Survival after amputation depended on the patient's constitution, the surgeon's speed, and sheer luck. Many did not survive. Those who did often became the cook, the traditional role for a man no longer fit for active duty. Scurvy was the great equalizer, striking every crew that spent more than a few weeks at sea without fresh provisions. It began with lethargy and aching joints, progressed to bleeding gums and loose teeth, then to the reopening of old wounds, and finally to death. Entire crews were incapacitated by it. The cure was known, citrus fruit, but the science behind it was not understood, and fresh fruit simply could not be stored for long voyages. A pirate who survived battle, storms, tropical disease, infected wounds, scurvy, and the general hazards of life at sea was genuinely lucky. The average career of a pirate was between 2 and 5 years. Most ended in capture, death in battle, or death by disease. The romantic retirement to a tropical island with a chest of gold was a fantasy then as it is now. The psychological toll was perhaps the least visible, but most pervasive hardship. The sea is vast, indifferent, and terrifying. Storms in the Caribbean and the Atlantic could appear with almost no warning, turning the ocean into a chaos of towering waves, shrieking wind, and horizontal rain. In a storm, a wooden sailing ship is a fragile thing. Masts snap, sails shred. The hull flexes and groans and leaks. Men are thrown from the rigging or washed overboard by waves. You cannot swim. Most sailors in this era could not. And if you go into the water, you die. Even in calm weather, the isolation is immense. Weeks might pass with nothing visible in any direction except water and sky. The monotony is crushing. The same food, the same faces, the same routines, the same cramped, stinking, rolling wooden world. Men developed superstitions, rituals, and obsessions to cope. They talked to the sea. They saw omens in birds and clouds. They feared calms more than storms, because a ship becalmed in the tropics, motionless under a burning sun with no wind and dwindling water, was a death sentence in slow motion. Homesickness, loneliness, and the knowledge that you could never return to legitimate society without risking the gallows created a particular kind of despair. Some men cracked. Accounts from the period describe pirates who became paranoid, erratic, violent toward their own crewmates. Others sank into a depressive lethargy, going through the motions of their duties, but losing interest in everything, including the prizes that were supposed to make this life worthwhile. The proximity to death was constant and corrosive. You watched men die regularly, from disease, from accidents, from wounds gone septic. The ocean itself was a graveyard without markers. When a man died at sea, his body was sewn into a hammock or a piece of sailcloth with a cannonball at his feet to make it sink, and it was tipped over the side. There was no grave to visit. He was simply gone, and the ship sailed on. The survivor's guilt, the accumulating grief, the sheer relentless stress of living in danger. These were invisible wounds that no pirate article addressed and no share of plunder could heal. Pirates were not free men living a carefree life. They were fugitives, trapped by their own choices in a world that was trying to kill them every single day. The end, when it came, was usually grim. The golden age of piracy ended not with a great battle but with a slow tightening of the noose. By the 1720s, colonial governments had decided that piracy was bad for business. The Royal Navy expanded its patrols. Former pirate havens were brought under control. Woodes Rogers, the new governor of the Bahamas, arrived in Nassau in 1718 with a simple offer: accept the king's pardon and live, or continue pirating and hang. Many accepted. Those who did not were hunted down methodically. The trials were public spectacles. The executions were deliberately theatrical. Pirates were hanged at the waterfront, their bodies coated in tar and suspended in iron cages called gibbets, left to rot in full view of the harbour as a warning to every sailor who passed. Captain William Kidd's body hung in a gibbet at Tilbury Point on the Thames for 3 years. Blackbeard was killed in a savage boarding action, and his severed head was hung from the bowsprit of the Royal Navy vessel that had caught him. Calico Jack Rackham and his crew were hanged in Port Royal in 1720. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the age, was killed by grapeshot during a battle with HMS Swallow in 1722. His crew threw his body overboard in full battle dress, as he had requested, to keep it from the authorities. By 1730, the Golden Age was over. A few pirates lingered in the Indian Ocean and the coast of West Africa, but the era of mass piracy in the Caribbean was finished. The entire explosion of piracy had lasted barely 50 years, one human lifetime. In that brief window, a few thousand desperate men had created a floating counter-society that terrified empires, disrupted global trade, and produced democratic institutions that would not appear on land for another century. They did it not out of idealism, but out of raw necessity, and the world they built was as ugly and uncomfortable as it was radical. The buried treasure of legend, Captain Kidd's supposed hoard, the lost gold of Lima, is almost entirely fiction. What little treasure existed was spent as fast as it was taken, in the taverns and brothels of ports that existed solely to take pirate money. The men who survived the Golden Age mostly vanished into obscurity, taking pardons, changing names, slipping into legitimate maritime work, or disappearing into colonial communities where no one asked about your past. What remains is the mythology, and the gap between myth and reality is as vast as the ocean these men sailed. A pirate ship was not a vehicle of freedom. It was a desperate compromise, a floating community of men who had exhausted every other option and chose a life that was brutal, short, and defined by constant physical suffering. The democracy was real, but it was a democracy of the doomed. The adventure was real, but it was inseparable from disease, starvation, and the ever-present knowledge of the gallows. The treasure was real, but it was usually mundane cargo: sugar, cloth, tools, provisions, not chests of gold coins. And the camaraderie was real, perhaps the most real thing about pirate life. Because when you are living in a world that wants you dead, the men standing next to you are all you have. When you step onto a cruise ship today, with its buffets and swimming pools and air-conditioned cabins, or when you watch a sunset from a clean, comfortable sailboat, remember what the same ocean meant 300 years ago. Remember the bilge stink and the weevil-riddled hardtack and the 14-inch hammock space. Remember the men who sat exposed on a plank over the open sea to relieve themselves, who danced to fiddle music on a rotting deck, who voted on their captain and divided their plunder with a fairness that would shame many modern corporations. A pirate ship was not a fairy tale. It was not a horror story, though it contained horrors enough. It was a machine for survival. Brutal, democratic, stinking, and astonishingly human. It was, in the end, simply life. Life stripped of every comfort and pretension, reduced to its essentials: food, shelter, loyalty, and the thin, stubborn hope that tomorrow might bring something better than today.